This week, Paul and I discuss the importance of thinking about what data you collect from the view of social media. In the news, GitHub survived the biggest DDoS attack ever recorded to date. Trustaco commits certificate seppuku, and how to suck at information security. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. IT Pro TV, binge-worthy learning for IT teams. Why is it binge-worthy? It's learning presented in an engaging and entertaining talk show format that beats voice-over PowerPoint snooze fests. Watch over 3,300 hours of content in their on-demand library, on your desktop, on the go, or in the comfort of your own living room. IT Pro TV is IT training you and your team actually want to watch, which means a better return on your learning investment. Get started with IT Pro TV for teams by visiting itpro.tv/Security Weekly and start a 7-day free trial and get 30% off standard or premium IT Pro TV memberships using the code SECWeekly30.
Welcome, everyone, to Episode 7, our 8th episode of Application Security Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet, and I am excited to be joined by my propitious co-host, Paul Asadorian. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Keith. It's wonderful to be here. Get my product placement drink out of the way. I was just actually bringing up a story. It's kind of interesting. I've got my my way that I read my news articles is Flipboard, and so I got I've been just flagging interesting stories, and they're not really security related, but I've been trying to cover one on every show every once in a while. So I later on remind me I can't add the story to the show notes just now, but I have a story about a not smartphone called a light phone, and it's kind of interesting.
Is it kind of like the Razr flip phones of old that couldn't do anything with apps? They could just make phone calls and texts?
That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what it is. It looks pretty cool. So we'll talk about it.
Everything old is new again.
That's right.
Paul, do we want to do any announcements during this segment, or do we want to catch those in the next segment?
We were talking about InfoSec World just a moment ago. You and I are both speaking at InfoSec World. We're actually talking about my talk, what was my talk title, Keith? I don't remember.
I think it was Everything an Enterprise Needs in Information Security is Free, or some such. There's a title out there on InfoSec World. Check it out.
Something like it. Hold on. The best things in enterprise security are free sometimes.
There you go. And they sure can be if you've got the man hours to go ahead and deploy those scripts and what have you. They can certainly save you some money.
That's what I'm realizing is there's a certain time commitment to that for sure. Because I was working with my DNS blacklisting open source servers, and I upgraded one and it blew up because patches just break things. I think it was Mike from ServiceNow was trying to tell me yesterday, one of our sponsors, that patches don't break things all the time. I'm like, well, that's pretty much close to that. He's like, no, some patches don't actually break things. I'm like, yeah, sort of. And so
it's kind of like those bundled or rolled up patches that can break things, right? It's because you don't know. It's the integration test problem that they just don't test for the interactions of the patches, and then ultimately that breaks things. So,
right. And then with Security Onion, there's just so many moving parts, and we'll probably talk about that on later shows as well. They are using Docker inside of that, which is pretty cool. Which it allows me to run some commands to do some debugging. But it takes time to set it up, and mine's just in an evaluation mode. I mean, if you were to deploy that, it would require, like you said, Keith, a little bit of engineering. But it is free, and I am getting alerts and acting on them and stuff. I was like, hey, I got this running. Hey guys, could you update Java on those two machines over there because it's out of date? Snort actually told me that.
There you go.
I thought that was pretty cool. So,
And people can catch that talk. So you said InfoSec World, March 19th to the 21st, so later this month. If you still are in need of a ticket, by the way, I hear you can actually get 15% off with the Security Weekly code OS18-SW for Security Weekly subscribers. So check out Paul's talk. I think it'll be fun and interesting, especially if you are trying to save some time and money for maybe some other tooling in your environment. And I will also be giving a talk on some development and application security stuff. So check that out. Hey, Paul, are you going to Source Boston, by the way? I know that's coming up, I think.
I am speaking at Source Boston about Docker, believe it or not.
Even better. It's 2 weeks from now, right? It's
No, it's May. Source 9th? Source Boston is May 9th through the 10th. SW89AEE2 Alpha Echo Echo 2 is the $100 off discount code. If you're going to InfoSec World, it's OS18-SW. That's all we had. There's another show that we're doing. Secure World Expo will be there. We're not speaking, but we will be there doing stuff. That's earlier. That's March 14th and 15th in Boston. And I will be speaking at a social engineering conference to round up my 3 talks that I'm working on. Social engineering your way into an amazing InfoSec career, which is very similar to a topic that April Wright will be talking about, which is awesome because she's a lot smarter than I am. So you probably want to see her talk rather than mine. But similar topic. I'll talk a little more, I think, about startups, and if you want to start your own startup as part of your career, what you need to do, and also some of the similar topics like how you sell things to management. So
nice. I had one special announcement, which is BugCrowd, the company that I work for, is hiring. We actually just finished our Series C funding round at $26 million, and we're expanding the headcount in our organization to scale. So check out bugcrowd.com/careers, or you can email me, hoodie@securityweekly.com, to find out more about any of the positions listed on there.
And you get a referral bonus, don't you? That's why you can. It's okay. It's okay.
It's true. It's absolutely true. I do. But you know what? I honestly want to make sure that anyone joins BugCrowd or decides that they want to join BugCrowd is both prepared for the level of effort that is going to go into the work that they will do with us, but also the rewards that come about from working at a startup. But now it's Series C funding at $26 million. It doesn't feel too startup-y
anymore. Yeah. No, it's awesome though.
So yeah. Yeah, for sure. And yeah, those referral bonuses don't hurt. I won't lie.
No, it doesn't. I mean, I think it's a valid structure, especially in this field, trying to find the right people, especially senior people, can be difficult. So I think that's a nice way. I've certainly benefited from that in the past as well, and even asked people on the show to apply for jobs. It's cool. Nice.
So with that, let's definitely jump into the topic for today, which I imagine the show title for this will be "You Are the Product," because lately or recently in the news, what has happened is Facebook has started requiring certain users to perform a malware scan of their device that they were logging in on. And so as a result of this, I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of being thoughtful and considerate to what data you as an organization are collecting, whether you're on the security team or whether you're a developer that's building out a platform that will aggregate some sort of data. And the reason that I think that this is an important topic is a fewfold. First, GDPR is a huge thing on every security company's mind right now, and it's all related to data collection, specifically in Europe, for any of the users that are using your platform or product there. But on top of that, what has happened is Facebook is now literally taking to that they are prescribing before you can actually log back into Facebook. The thing that I found interesting about the entire article was that the Facebook PR person specifically says that they don't collect enough information to actually tell whether or not there is malware running on your device. So it seems backwards that they're forcing users to scan for malware if they can't actually tell that there's malware present. Paul, I'm curious to get your thoughts specifically on data collection, because I know that you, I imagine, must collect some sort of data for the wiki itself when people come to the site. What are your thoughts about making sure you're protecting it, making sure that you're thinking about the data that you collect?
Well, I think this is awful that you're forced to run software from any provider in order to gain access to your site. I mean, I could see potentially making this process available to developers. If you're going to create an app, they want to make sure that you don't have malware on your system that could potentially infect a large percentage of Facebook users, right? If I'm publishing an app to Facebook and people are running that app in Facebook, I can see the process being a lot more stringent for that. But just a user logging into Facebook to use the service, which is, as you've pointed out in your articles, Keith, are actually losing users for the first time ever. They're on the decline. I think that's a sign that Facebook is slowly losing some market share and not as innovative as it once was. And I think a lot of people who would be normally using Facebook kind of look at it as the social network for old people now, and are off to other things. I guess the trend is now Snapchat and Instagram. Now, Instagram is a Facebook property, of course, but certainly the tide on social media is changing away from Facebook. So to force now, given that they're on the decline, and then force people to run software, which first they're not even sure that you have malware, so they're just like run it anyway. I think it's just bizarre. I mean, I could see maybe if they know that you've been the subject of some kind of scam or phishing campaign inside of Facebook, allowing you to run it or giving you the option to run it as like we're trying to help you and maybe piloting the program like that. But to just drop it, and is this like random users, Keith, or?
I mean, to the extent that what the PR person says specifically about the situation is that, quote unquote, our visibility into each account on a given device isn't complete enough for us to checkpoint based only on the device without factoring in whether the particular account is acting in a suspicious manner. So all they're saying is they are collecting user behavior that says that you are, quote unquote, acting outside of some sort of normalized level for yourself as a user. Therefore, they prompt the scan itself. Now, I mean, if you're a person, if say you're sharing your Facebook with your spouse, or you're letting someone browse on your computer and they happen to jump onto your Facebook, that is enough to trigger this sort of behavior, I would imagine, by itself. So it sounded like, based on the fact that they have 1 billion plus users, it was somewhere in the range of less than 10 million that were actually experiencing this. I think the article itself says right around 1 million at the time of the article was actually written. So it's a very small percentage for Facebook itself, but yeah, I mean, they're on the decline from the perspective of actual like registered user count in North America. And then on top of that, most of their money is based on either data that they aggregate and sell to advertising companies, or quite frankly, the advertisements themselves that are purchased on Facebook. So it's almost like they're somewhat starting to shoot themselves in the foot by not only are users logging in less, but now they're actually preventing users from logging in the first place if they identify quote unquote anomalous behavior. I speculate, and I'd be curious to get your thoughts on this though, Paul. How much do you think that this is probably related to the inquiries around the whole Russian operations around the 2016 election? Because I get a feeling that this is probably them coming down very hard on that sort of behavior, or concerns about that sort of behavior.
No, I think it's a valid point. You know, certainly Facebook has been under huge scrutiny for that, and I think it's still presumptuous to believe that external actors actually did have an influence on the election. I think people are paranoid that they could, and not just through Facebook, but through other forms of social media, in generating basically fake news and trying to sway people in a certain direction or the other. I think it's certainly possible, but then again, I probably watch too much like Black Mirror or something. So.
Yeah. Or if you haven't watched Altered Carbon yet, definitely give that a watch too.
I just saw that because I was looking at Netflix shows, because we were questioning whether Black Mirror was a Netflix show or not. It is in fact a Netflix property, and I saw next to it Altered. What is Altered Carbon?
It's a sci-fi futuristic show, somewhat similar to Blade Runner in terms of kind of the science and technology that they put into it, but. I won't spoil it. There is, I will say, a lot of adult content, and by that I mean nudity, swearing, violence. So
Sweet.
Don't watch it with your kids around.
What?
So jumping back a little bit toward Facebook, though, what I found really interesting about the situation is when Facebook is now forcing these scans on that small subset of users, one of the things that they tell users is when they agree to conduct the scan, that Facebook will collect data to quote unquote improve the security on and off Facebook for that user's device. So they are doing actual data collection, not just saying, green light, red light for the malware, which by itself seems pretty vague and somewhat questionable. I wonder how or why they're collecting that data and where they intend to use it. I'm curious to kind of get your thoughts there as well, Paul, because again, trying to drive back toward more like the data collection thing, or topic. it's interesting to me that they're collecting any data at all, given that they really only need to have a true or false scenario here. What are your kind of thoughts there?
Well, I think Facebook is going to collect all kinds of data about users for all kinds of nefarious purposes, perhaps, in certain privacy violations. Because look, there's a lot of different ways to solve this problem, right? I mean, you can force a password reset, you can force the user to activate two-factor authentication, and just those two activities are probably really good in terms of security. However, if you know or suspect that there's malware on the system, certainly you're probably going to clean that before you make them change any of their credentials or add a two-factor in there. But I think that if Facebook is tracking your behavior, they're not just using that for security purposes, right? I mean, they're selling that to advertisers and doing all kinds of other things with it, some of which could help, some of which could probably hurt your privacy.
And it's interesting at the end of the day how it's a situation where Facebook, so I have heard and I imagine to be true that using those like Facebook icons that get loaded on, say, the bottom of the wiki that we have here for Security Weekly or other pages, that Facebook is actually tracking users based on that sort of behavior as well. So it's not only what you're doing on Facebook, but what other sites you're going to that are then getting pinged back to Facebook servers from the requests that are being made by the user. So at the end of the day, I think the lesson learned here is Facebook is kind of going all in on the data collection and aggregation side. And quite frankly, I think that the counter argument to anyone that says, well, how dare they make you run antivirus on your computer is it's also free. I mean, it doesn't cost you anything except all of your data. So to that end, it's kind of like you could choose to stop using it, or you could let them run a scan on your device to actually then continue using the service. I'd be curious to know how many people have chosen to simply just move away, given that they've had an actual drop in daily users in the US and Canada as a result of this kind of behavior and other sort of data aggregation techniques that they are starting to leverage. Needless to say, it's a situation where I don't know that they are in the best light right now for a lot of different reasons. And I think that this is just kind of one more thorn in the side of Facebook for all the situations that are starting to arise from it.
Yeah, and so what's the story on how they manipulated 689,003 users' emoticons for science? That article,
emotions.
Well, that article comes from the first two sources of your articles are sites that block if you have an ad blocker running, which that's probably a debate that's actually kind of similar to what we're talking about now.
It is, and I will have to see if I can find maybe some Google News links for these to update them in the show notes. So this is actually a really old article, but I wanted to highlight it because I think that it's important to show people or infer to our listeners just what you can do with data aggregation in larger scales. So this is an article that's now almost 4 years old. It dates back to June 28th of 2014, which led to my actually stop using Facebook entirely. So what they did way back when is they worked with a university to collect data, and in this case, that was Cornell University, of 689,003 users. What they did is they showed a subset of those users only negative things or things that could be perceived as negative to determine how that would impact the user's use of Facebook. And then they had the control group, which is no manipulation of their data feed. And at the end of the day, this kind of came to light, and from there, a number of people left Facebook from like the user standpoint. But Cornell caught a lot of heat for this because there was no internal review board, there was no informed consent, and they were manipulating people's emotions or trying to at least do some sort of manipulation of emotions. So when it comes to ubiquitous social media presence like Facebook, any data that is collected can and will be used perhaps against you, or at least not necessarily for your best interest, but for the interest of Facebook. And I thought that this article, especially that it goes back to showing actual documented behavior of Facebook as an organization, shows that they're not afraid to manipulate people's emotions or behaviors for quote unquote science. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious to get your thoughts, especially because in this case, as you said, this is actually something that is a site that you can't get to unless you turn off your ad blocker. And I'll have to check because my ad blocker is on, but it still allows me to get to the site. So
Have you
I'm going to now have to
whitelisted?
update my ad
They
blocker.
want you to whitelist that site.
It's probably the case.
And then some of the
but yeah,
whitelisted sites will actually serve up malware through advertising to kind of go along with what we're talking about, which I hate.
Yep.
I'm like, I don't want. It's so like you've made the decision to stop using Facebook. Like I've made the decision that I'm not turning off my ad blocker to read content on the internet, and I'm not paying you money because I don't like the way that it's presented to me, and I also feel like that information can be found on sites that aren't using an ad blocker.
True.
So.
And in fact, I would imagine that as we move toward, different modernization schemes for making money, we will see things change as we have with, say, CoinHive, right? Like they've started mining Monero as opposed to serving you ads.
Yeah, that's the choice they give you. Either disable your ad blocker or you can just mine some cryptocurrency for us. I don't like that option either.
Well, and I think it's interesting because you and I probably don't like that option, but to the end user, it really doesn't affect their impact or affect their experience and impact their performance of using the site. So they probably don't know any better. And in aggregate, that's why I think that has become an option for organizations as a whole. And to that end, I guess to some degree, it could be argued that from the data aggregation perspective, that's better than being served up ads that are probably also doing some sort of data aggregation of your use of the site. So I don't know. It's the devil you know versus the devil you don't. Would you rather be mining cryptocurrency and not being served potential malicious ads and not having to worry about data aggregation? Or would you rather try to block ads? I think that, and we're kind of getting away from the main topic, but have you ever heard of the Brave browser?
Mm-mm.
So it's a browser that's, I believe, based on Chromium. And they have a model where inside of it, you can have a cryptocurrency wallet like associated where you can put like $5 or $10 worth of cryptocurrency in the wallet. And then at the end of every month, depending on the sites that have registered to actually receive portions of that, it will look at your basic walkthrough of different sites to see how long you are actually on a given site. Say you're on Forbes or you're on GitHub or you're on New York Times. And the percentage that gets paid out from that wallet can be determined. So if I only want to give $5 a month and I want to make sure that I'm splitting it based on the actual use of the site for that time, I can then have it just auto pay to those sites that I listed, depending on how often I go to them or how often I use them.
Yeah,
so
and
trying to
usually
take the model and say, I can pay them.
In Google's model, Google will take a percentage of that is the models that they've proposed. I don't know if they put any of those in place, but they've talked about using Google Wallet essentially for that same purpose. And Google gets a percentage and then passes off the remainder to the advertiser.
Yep, exactly. And so to that end, they are trying to change the game from, I don't want to mine currency on my computer, I don't want to see advertisements, and I don't want to give up my data, but I still want to be able to, if I am willing, provide some sort of financial return to the organizations at a appropriate percentage of how often I'm using their site or their service, which I think is a new and interesting idea. I don't know how widespread it is in terms of adoption, because let's face it, people are like, I can use it for free. Why would I pay $5 a month to go out to all these sites? But it'll be interesting to see how the future shapes the way the internet takes place, especially now that we're looking at things like miners versus ads versus data aggregation and so forth. I know that we're coming up on probably time for this segment, but I did want to get into the learning and tools segment if that's okay with you, Paul.
Oh, yeah. Let's do it.
So one of the things I actually wanted to call out is a free tool called GitLeaks. It checks Git repos for secrets and keys. So if you have like a private key, or you're using some sort of like hard-coded password, for example, it will go ahead and look over the history of the repository and confirm or try to pull out and flag that data for you. It is actually faster than TruffleHog, which is another open source tool that I have created a Docker container for. It's up on Docker Hub if you want to check it out. But it goes ahead and it will actually look through the history of your Git repository and then find those keys for you, call them out, and then you can go and remove them appropriately. So yeah, definitely for those organizations that have had some issues with keys leaking as a result of pushing things out to open source or otherwise, that's a good place to start. The other one that I also wanted to call out in the learning and tools is there's a link under learning and tools number 2. It allows you to go ahead and change any Unix timestamp to an actual date time format, including ISO 8601 format. So it's unix.click. You can either select the date accordingly, and it will give you the timestamp from Unix time as well as the ISO 8601, or you can put in the timestamp that you have instead of maybe one of your bro logs. And from there, you can actually see on the calendar where that falls. You might find that actually fun and interesting to play with, Paul, once you get some of your tooling internally spun up.
Yeah, if that ever happens.
Just 2 more items I wanted to call out. The first is actually from one of our partners, Signal Sciences. They just released a DevOps roadmap for security as a PDF document. It actually is really nice. I was looking through it the other night, and it calls out a lot of the processes that maybe not a lot of people think about when it comes to integrating DevOps and security into one DevSecOps kind of workflow. So I would definitely recommend going and picking up that PDF and giving it a read, just because I think that it's not only great content, but Signal Sciences does great work and they have a really great tool. The last item, and this is actually going to be somewhat, I don't know, maybe prescient or even had really good forethought when it was written by Charles Seif, is a book called Virtual Unreality. It talks about how the internet is in effect becoming what used to be the commons, where anyone could go and post up their flyers or what have you. And more or less that no matter who you are or what your beliefs are, because the internet is now so pervasive in our lives, you will always find a community of people who agree with and will reinforce your beliefs accordingly. So if you're looking for a fun and interesting read, check out Virtual Unreality by Charles Seif.
Yeah, I'm excited to read that. That actually, because I've always held the similar beliefs in that because there's so many people on the internet and so many ways to collaborate and share and network, that you can find not just people but also resources that could support your viewpoint in either direction. And that's a lot of, being on Facebook, that's a lot of what I find is if you believe take a certain viewpoint, that you can go find people and or resources that will support that, even as preposterous as that viewpoint may be, which I always thought was interesting.
The interesting thing about that book as well is that's like 4 or 5 years old at this point. I mean, it more or less predicted events as they occurred in 2016 with the use of social media as an intelligence operation and the influence that it could potentially have. So it's interesting to highlight it now in light of all of the things that are going on in today's society. So with that, we're going to take a break, come back and cover the news.
Sweet.
Just waiting on Mark.
Just wait. Mark's by himself today. John's at the dentist again.
So I've heard.
Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW. Layered Insight is the industry's first embedded security approach for containers. Trusted by Global 1000 enterprises to secure their containerized applications, it's the only solution that requires no root privileges, has zero dependency on the underlying infrastructure, and is fully portable across any container environment. Unified DevOps and SecOps, enabling the rapid development of containerized applications without worrying about security. To learn more, please visit layeredinsight.com/ASW.
Welcome back, everyone, to Application Security Weekly. This is the news for week of, that would have been February 25th. So we are going to cover a couple of older articles here. I did want to start, though, with the fact that 7,900 vulnerabilities didn't make it into the CVE database in 2017. So I thought that this was a really interesting article for us to cover, Paul, because of the 18,000 CVE IDs that were assigned or allotted last year in 2017, almost 7,000 of them were in a reserved status, despite over 1,000 of them having a public disclosure being indicated or something that was going to happen. Curious to get your thoughts there, because you've been in the industry for such a long time, Paul, that you've seen the growth of CVE IDs over that kind of period of time. What do you think of the fact that 7,000 are now absent?
If you've spent any time researching or paying attention to the research that surrounds CVE, spoken to people at MITRE, Josh Corman talked about this last year at Source. I've done some research projects in my time about CVE. This is really no surprise. Not every vulnerability gets a CVE. Now, there are some light at the end of the tunnel, but if we just look at the CVE problem, for example, there's lots of stats in that article, but the stat that I like to use based on my own research, like any vulnerability scanner out there, the top ones that have the best CVE coverage, I think I want to say we're around 40, maybe 50,000 or less. And currently today, if you go to CVEdetails.com, there are 97,367 CVEs in the database. And we know from other people doing research that that doesn't cover everything. Now, what's interesting is when we talk about finding or discovering vulnerabilities, we can even keep this specific to web applications. We all know that generic tests for a particular vulnerability or exposure or configuration misuse can find vulnerabilities that we don't necessarily have like a straight up CVE for. So that's kind of the light at the end of the tunnel, is you don't necessarily have to have a CVE assigned to a vulnerability in order to discover it in your process. In other words, application scanners, wherever you're doing that scanning, static analysis, dynamic analysis, wherever, or a traditional vulnerability scanner, or something that's looking at your source code repositories and trying to discover vulnerable library versions. That one's tougher. I think it's more specific. They may add checks for things that don't have a CVE. And those are hard to track, because how do you know what they are? Because you don't have a key, right? There's no key for it. So I think that this is, certainly a problem. I don't think it's as big a problem as some might think, because again, we do have the capabilities to detect some of these conditions. They're just not tied back to a CVE. And so some of the kind of when you're evaluating a solution, if you want to look at it that way, a lot of people use CVE as the evaluation criteria. It's not the best criteria. It is a measure, and you should take that in consideration when you're evaluating. But also, you have to consider, like, what if someone has a particular method to discover a vulnerability or exposure that could cover 5,000 CVEs that you just haven't referenced those 5,000 CVEs. So that's I've actually done some research in this space. It is a little frightening, but not as bad as people think.
And what's interesting to me is for a lot of organizations, as my friend Brian would say, The enterprise will have to standardize on something. And to this end, most of them will say, look, if it has a CVE, we'll look at the CVSS score for it, and then we will address it accordingly. And unfortunately, that's kind of a standardized process for a lot of organizations, especially the bigger ones. At the end of the day, you've got to get the work done somehow. And so I imagine that that is as good as any process to start with. But unfortunately, I think a lot of organizations don't take the approach that you're suggesting here, Paul, which is they don't go a step further to say, look, we can still identify vulnerabilities that maybe don't have a CVE number associated with them, but are still a risk to our organization. What I found especially interesting in this article was in 2017, web-related issues accounted for over 50% of all of the 18,000 vulnerabilities that were disclosed. And 31, or nearly 32% in this case, actually had public exploits. So to me, that just, I think, goes to show not only the reason that the show exists, but the increasing presence of the use of web technologies today in terms of cloud or otherwise that are now being more thoroughly vetted and actually being recognized in the CVE database accordingly. Curious to get your thoughts there, especially given the fact that there were over 50% of those vulnerabilities were web related. Does that surprise you at all, Paul?
No, not at all. You know, I was speaking with Faru Mavatuna from NetSparker actually about this topic, and you know what he said was kind of scary was that some of the ways that we identify vulnerabilities in web applications can be very specific to a version number, right? Or a specific condition in the code that they're testing for that publicized vulnerability. However, as you very well know, and our listeners know, people tend to modify code. You could very well modify a configuration, the code itself, how you interact with that can obscure that vulnerability. So the way you're checking for it, it's like, oh no, you're okay, unless you have some kind of, in NetSparker's case, they make a dynamic scanner. So Faru was like, yeah, unless we go test that, and I don't care what version it is, I'm going to test for the vulnerability in the application. And even if you've modified it, I'm going to say you got SQL injection. And you may say, well, you know, I've upgraded that library. It's not vulnerable. Yeah, but you modified it and still made it vulnerable to SQL injection. And you can find that sometimes by actually testing it in practice, that the software that looks at the libraries you're deploying and says, nope, that one's good because you upgraded it. But the dynamic scanner will say it's not good because I tested it and there's still SQL injection in it. So that's some of the, it kind of reinforced for me the importance of still having some kind of dynamic scanner in your SDLC looking at your code. I still think that's important. I think we've talked about that too in terms of functional testing and security testing still being part of that DevOps process.
For sure. And in fact, I mean, there's the opposite problem too, where the scanner is telling you you're vulnerable, but you've updated the library, like the sub library in some sort of subdirectory that is actually where the vulnerability is presented. And just because the version number hasn't changed on your configuration
Correct.
file, it still says you're vulnerable even though you're not.
Mm-hmm.
So the only way to really know is to actually test, right?
Yep.
Which is where I think that, tooling can certainly help. Crowdsourced security testing can certainly address that as well. From a, you think you fixed it, but maybe you haven't perspective. I actually wanted to move to our next story, though, Paul, if that's okay with you.
Yeah. You want to do the Trustico?
I do, yes.
Hot mess.
In fact, so I wanted to call out DigiCert put out a statement on what I think most people know by now has been an incredible dumpster fire of certificate authority issues related to Trustico. Basically, Trustico requested a revocation of their semantic geotrust, thought, and rapid SSL certificates, claiming that the certificates were compromised. And then when they were asking for proof from Trustico, Trustico's CEO sent approximately 20,000 certificate private keys to DigiCert, at which point DigiCert had no choice but to actually act in accordance with the CA/browser forum baseline requirement, which mandated that they revoke the compromised certificates within 24 hours. So effectively what happens here is Trustico says, we don't want to have these certs anymore. DigiCert, we want you to revoke them. DigiCert says, we can't unless you've been compromised. And then the CEO says, all right, well, here's 20,000 plus certificates or private keys for certificates for companies that need to be revoked. And DigiCert was like, what? Mm-hmm. So this has broken quite a lot of number of websites out there, Paul. But I'm curious to kind of get your thoughts here because this sounds like an abuse of the rules on the part of Trustico.
Well, yeah, I think it is too. I also do want to state that DigiCert is actually a sponsor of Paul Security Weekly. Although their advertisements are not running yet, they are very much a sponsor. And so we went out to our contacts. They provided us with this article that you linked to in the show notes, Keith. And so a couple things, right? It was DigiCert has purchased Symantec's SSL cert certificate authority business. So when they say Symantec certs, that's really a DigiCert controlled certificate. DigiCert did what they had. They were basically forced to revoke these certificates. I think DigiCert, in talking with people about this, DigiCert and likely the other certificate authorities, GeoTrust, Thought, and RapidSSL, acted in accordance with the proper guidelines and had to revoke those certificates. Now, the questions that I have are on the Trustico side. We were speculating last night. So, first of all, how did Trustico have the private keys? Were those leaked to them by the attackers? Did they somehow have access to the private keys without permission to the users? Did they ask permission of the users to do anything that they did? Why didn't they just leave it to the users to tell them, look, your certificate's been compromised, you have to reissue it, and just leave it up to the user? Are they looking out for the best interest of the user or not? Or do they get money by having these users renew or re-key those certificates or issue new certificates? I don't know. I don't know the answers to a lot of those questions, but it does beg a lot of questions.
That last point is actually something that's really interesting as well, because I know that the sale of certificates, depending on the form of certificate itself, has been somewhat brought into question with the rise of Let's Encrypt, right? Like that has taken a lot of the kind of lower level certificate market out from underneath some of these other companies. So yeah, it definitely begs a lot of questions. How they had the keys is something that baffles me currently, but that the CEO just sent them over in an email is mind blowing.
Yeah,
right?
That's just
how.
I don't know what it is.
I wouldn't be surprised if some sort of lawsuit comes forward against Trustico for this, because quite frankly, that's almost like, gosh, I'm trying to think of a good analogy that I could make here, but actively compromising your own keys rather than just confirming that your keys have been compromised seems like such a violation of some sort of law or policy, or at least it's something that will probably be questioned somewhere, I hope.
I want to talk about your story number 3 in there, critical Linux file system permissions, because I think as it relates to application development, Keith, I really think that it's one of the most common security violations that I see from developers. Anytime I've taken over a project or gotten involved in providing the systems administration for developers, I almost often or always find some like gross violation of file system permissions that could potentially lead to some security incident. And that, of course, stems from a troubleshooting process has taken place. And in that troubleshooting process, Chmod 777, like they need T-shirts that say Chmod 777.
Oh no!
And sometimes that fixes it. So they're like, yes, 777 for everything. But of course, that, especially when we talk about PHP applications, I've seen that a lot. Or just even now with Docker and DevOps, that is now more common. To be included in Docker files and in other things, just to like make things work. So I think this is a huge problem, and I think it's something that like DevOps doesn't necessarily solve inherently. Like nothing removes the requirement for understanding proper file system permissions, and developers, I mean, as well as everyone who uses Linux, right? I think are really quick to just change those permissions to be world readable and writable and executable.
And the worst part about this situation, and so this is specifically related to NPM, so the Node Package Manager. As someone wrote on Twitter, and I'm forgetting who it was now, they basically said, look, for the past 20 plus years, we have been trying to convince the world that package managers are safe. And in version 5.7.0 of Node Package Manager, they effectively had a bug where it was traversing and running chown on the wrong and often critical file system folders simply by running a command like sudo npm dash dash help or sudo npm update dash g would cause a file system change of ownership for things like slash etsy slash user slash boot and other critical system directories to be changed ownership to npm rather than to root or others. And so it was just a colossal bug from a Node Package Manager
and
user.
I've
Which,
seen
by the
this
way,
a lot. I've seen this a lot, actually, Keith. And not specifically with Node Package Manager, but other software and packages that you're using. When you apply an update, as part of that update, they have to change file permissions and often do that in an insecure manner. That's something I've seen since like the beginning of time.
Yeah, and it's just like for this, I mean, especially if they're doing it badly, right? Like you think about npm and what it's installing. It's installing all of your packages that are actually managing all of your front end web interfaces. So in some cases, it's actually things like your ORM or other sort of things that are working with the database, right? And so you're often running npm to actually deal with a lot of the server side and sometimes even the client side JavaScript presentation layers. And so to that end, to have such a bug where they are doing things badly, where they maybe didn't even like run a test, like you'd think that a unit test or an integration test would be in place here to say, hey, when we're actually traversing these file directories to make sure that we're updating things appropriately for our installation and then maybe returning them to the state that they were in, that this would have been caught. And the fact that it was actually put out in, I wouldn't call it a major release, but it's certainly not a minor release because 5.7.0 would mean that they kicked it up a notch, right? So, yeah, this is just all bad on a lot of levels. And I believe it has been fixed since, but to that end, to have just bad file changes take place on something as simple as like a help command, come on, npm, like step up your game.
What else you want to
Paul,
talk
I
about?
actually wanted to I was going to say, I know that we're a little bit pressed for time. We have about 10 minutes here. I actually wanted to cover something related to code signing certificates, actually. So story number 2 under the if you build it, they will come is related to the fact that Recorded Future, which is a threat intelligence organization out of Boston, has cited that the rise of code signing certificate counterfeit instances is taking place at a much larger rate than it used to. And it's interesting to me because the sense that code signing is effectively a hashing of the code that is being released so that you can determine cryptographically that it is in fact being released by the same developer or being released by the same group or organization. It's intended to let you know that the code changes that have taken place were intended, were purposeful, and of course were signed appropriately. And so since 2011, the stolen credentials of code signing certificates has started to take place. I think we saw it with Stuxnet, for example. There was code signing that took place for some of the Microsoft patches that in turn were actually not really released by Microsoft. And there was a third-party company that was compromised that the certificate signing was taking place from. But in this case, they've seen this grow significantly through 2015. And to no one's surprised, really. I mean, if you think about it, we're starting to see a world where SSL is, in TLS specifically, is starting to become ubiquitous. HTTPS is being prioritized by things like Google. And to the extent that code signing is so important for developers to validate that the code that they are pulling down from places like GitHub or NPM are real and authentic, this is getting to be more and more of a problem where if you can't actually monitor that the code is good, you could be pulling down bad code. And if I'm actually now taking a situation where I can, create a counterfeit and then say that, yeah, no, this code is good, pull it down, this is going to lead to compromises of organizations at some point, especially when we look at things like NPM. What are your thoughts there, Paul?
I think this is an attack that we're going to see for years to come. I certainly think that it's something we've seen in the past and we're going to continue to see because it exploits people's trust. And, anytime you can exploit people's trust like this, it's going to be something attackers prey on. So it's not surprising.
For sure. And again, as code becomes more ubiquitously available, in the case of like GitHub, I think that, yeah, you're right. We're going to definitely start seeing more of this. And I hope that the processes through which code signing is taking place kind of steps up their game cryptographically as well, to prevent the kind of counterfeit certificates that are taking place as we see in this article. Actually wanted to jump to a discussion on a GitHub event that happened recently on Wednesday at about 12:15 Eastern time. GitHub was starting to be hit with 1.35 terabytes or terabits, excuse me, per second traffic as a result of a mem caching problem that was reflecting out to GitHub. I mean, can you imagine the kind of devastation that could take place, Paul, if GitHub was no longer able to serve up content to users that are developers that are actually making use of different code repositories?
Yeah, that would be bad.
Yeah,
that would
thankfully,
be bad.
Akamai. I was going to say Akamai stepped up and started covering this as probably through services that GitHub has purchased. So about 10 minutes after the DDoS started, it actually was basically mitigated and brought down. But the fact that someone can, without the use of a botnet, use memcache servers that exist out on the internet to serve up content and reflectively attack based on spoofing the source out to places like GitHub at 1.35 terabits per second. I don't know very many organizations that can withstand that kind of firepower. And I assume that what will happen as a result of this is this was a test and companies will be held ransom for DDoS with this sort of attack. And quite frankly, as of apparently Shodan, there's about 100,000 memcache servers that reflect out at about 50 times the request back to the spoofed IP address. So 1 kilobyte becomes 50 kilobytes effectively for each one of those. So this is just all bad.
It is bad.
And so, Paul, I know that for the food for thought section, just jumping into that because we have a few minutes left here, you wanted to talk about this light phone. Tell me more about this.
Yeah, so this came up in some of my news feeds, and it's actually the second version of the light phone. So the original light phone could just make calls. This one allows you to call and text. It's essentially a phone that's 6.5 millimeters thick and the same length and width as a credit card. So that's pretty cool. So my kind of like use case for this was like maybe you'd take this like when you travel, or specifically if you're going to a security conference, you don't want to take your phone with all of your apps on it and stuff. You could take one of these. Where my kind of use case falls down is like, what if you're traveling and you need to call for an Uber? I don't.
Right.
Can you do that with just calls and text? Like, I'm pretty sure you need the app. I don't think that there's phones at Uber to call up and say, hey, can you send me an Uber? Pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, audience, but I'm pretty sure that you need the app for that. So I guess that'd be one of my feature requests. I would like to use this for travel because it's small, it's light. I don't have to put all my applications on it with all of my two-factor and passwords and credential, like on my phone today, right? There's LastPass, social media, all of the apps to control all of my smart devices and home devices. My email and Google account is on there. Like, there's a lot of stuff on my phone that I don't necessarily need to take with me all the time, except for those like convenience type features. OpenTable is another one that comes to mind. Like, especially if I'm out and about, like the apps that I truly need to use, I mean, unless I'm posting pictures of my food on social media, are OpenTable to make or check reservations, in Uber to get from point A to point B. So,
yeah, and to that end, unless you're in a city that is known for its taxi service like London, I can only imagine that not having your Uber or Lyft app is going to be a cause for real problems for you.
Yeah.
I did want to cover one or actually two more articles specifically. Story number one under the food for thought section I thought was really interesting. We don't have to go too deep into it, but Mark Cuban, who's a somewhat famous investor, basically was saying that as a result of artificial intelligence and the growth and adaptation of artificial intelligence over the next 10 or 15 years is actually going to make majors like philosophy or psychology more valuable than computer science because effectively the machines will start coding themselves. Really curious to get your thoughts there, Paul, especially because you've seen this industry change over time. As have I, when going from a 28A dial-up when I was a kid to now where I'm doing video streaming, podcasting, right? To that end, I'm not sure he's wrong, but I'd be really interested to get your thoughts.
That makes me older than you because I started out with a 14.4 modem.
Well, thankfully, as they say, I'm trying to remember, the curve, exponential curve over time of growth of technology, you can't be that much older than me.
That's
in
true.
That case.
That's true. That's true. I think it's interesting to speculate that computers will write all the code themselves. Although, I mean, given that humans will be coding the algorithms for computers to write code, there'll still be issues. So I don't think it really solves our security problems. I think it's an interesting observation from Mark Cuban. I don't think it's a game changer, and probably a long ways away, and we'll never truly know until we get there.
For sure. I think that it will probably creep up on us more than anything, but I would be very interested to see what the world looks like based on kind of what he sees as the future of, people that can ask the right questions of the computer rather than people that can actually code it themselves, and how that will affect society overall, which it might not be necessarily a bad thing if we have more philosophical thinkers in the world than people that just sit in a closet and write code all day,
Yeah.
So the last one that I wanted to end on, though, today, Paul, was something here called How to Suck at Information Security. It is a PDF by Lenny Zeltser, so SANS Internet Storm Center handler, that put this out. I thought it was a great checklist of, if your organization is doing the things on this list, you're doing security badly. And rather than taking the top 20 list of security controls or things you should be doing, it highlights the things that mean that you're not doing security very well. One of the ones that I really enjoyed was the security practices section on the bottom middle that says, you can suck at information security if you say no whenever asked to approve a request.
Yep.
Did you have any favorites, Paul?
I liked deploy a security product out of the box without tuning it.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good one.
Or in the same section under security tools, buy an expensive product when a simple and cheap fix may address 80% of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Cheap and or free, as you will find out at InfoSec World at Pulse Talk.
Yes.
So
yes.
It is a rather funny PDF. It's not really in the form of like checkboxes per se, but I thought it was really great because it calls out a lot of issues in security that people suddenly think that if I get this certification or if I adopt this framework that we're suddenly secure, and it's not necessarily the case. As the call out in security policy and compliance here for what Lenny says, jump into a full-blown adoption of frameworks such as ISO 27001, 27002 before you're ready. Because quite frankly, a lot of organizations aren't ready, and they really should take the time to get ready before they do that.
You know what I find interesting too, and it's one of my points on logging. Delete logs because they get too big to read.
Yeah,
or just too big in general. Like I was, messing around with stuff lately, and it's like, well, is it because I'm out of disk space, or are the logs too big to parse, and so, you just redirect or pipe dev null right into your log files to fix the problem. And you might have just deleted a whole bunch of evidence that could have led to discovering a compromise, for example. So,
and you would hope that with the price of disk space being as small as it is today, especially if you push things out to like tape through Amazon, right? Like the cold storage, you really shouldn't be deleting logs because they get too big to read. You should be making sure that you are effectively parsing those logs for the data that you actually need, which brings us full circle to the beginning of this episode, which is only collect the data that you really need to be collecting. If you collect too much more, you're going to find that you get a lot of noise in that signal. So with that, I want to wrap up this week. Thank you everyone for joining us this week for another episode of Application Security Weekly. Remember to git, commit, and stay classy.